Welcome back. We now switch to the historical period that shows the consequences of what the Athenians under Pericles did within the Greek world to build up their mighty empire and their grandiose power scheme among all of their allies. We're going to talk over the next several videos, which in fact is the concluding segment of the history for the background for the tragic plays we're reading. We're going to talk about the run-up to the Peloponnesian War, 431 to 404 BC, and then once we have covered what introduced it over the next couple of videos, then we'll spend the remaining historical videos talking about the Peloponnesian War itself. So the first thing to realize is that the Peloponnesian War, as we call it, actually was not the first one. As we've mentioned it in a couple of previous videos, there actually was a previous Peloponnesian War that scholars also call in order to mention that there had been a conflict previously between the Athenian allies and the Spartan allies. In order to distinguish it from the main war, we refer to it as the First Peloponnesian War, and it went from 461 to 446 BC. The first thing on this to note, 461, is you may realize that this is in the same decade when those revolts were starting to happen in the Delian League, and also when Pericles was having his showdown with Cimon. You may remember that Pericles insisted on a very proactive anti-Sparta stance for the Athenians as they built up their power, and Cimon, Pericles' chief rival politically in Athens, was much more in favor of relatively benign pro-Spartan relations with that city. So in the years before excuse me, the Peloponnesian War, Pericles had tried to eliminate Cimon from competition by first trumping up a charge of bribery against him a few years before this, when Cimon came back from a campaign. And thereafter, when the Spartans had the incident with the earthquake where they offended the Athenians, thereafter changing the government around so that the Athenians now were very indebted to Pericles himself, such as with the jury court fee that they would receive when they served on the jury courts. And as a result, Cimon's political view ended up being eclipsed. So 461 BC happens to be the year when Cimon ended up ostracized for 10 years because of a motion put forward by Pericles to carry out an ostracism, and then the subsequent success of that motion in having Cimon being declared the political black sheep for that particular year. So with Cimon's departure, Pericles was now in a position to carry out a very aggressive and harsh anti-Athenian stance with very little opposition. Now, separately from that, a conflict grew up in 461 BC between a Spartan ally, Corinth, and at that time an Athenian ally, Megara. If you look at your map, you will see that Corinth and Megara lie almost side by side. There is not very much space between them along the isthmus of Greece. So if you basically put Corinth, let's say, well, from your perspective, over here, and then you put Megara, like about there, there was a conflict between them about exactly where the border lay. And as a result, Corinth ended up appealing to Sparta, and Megara ended up appealing to Athens. With the two big powers suddenly drawn into a conflict, Corinth ended up persuading the Spartans to invade Attica and thereby carry out all-out war against the Athenians. And bear in mind that this is only 2 decades after the conclusion of the Persian Wars. So in this war, there was really only intermittent fighting. And interestingly, the most interesting part of the fighting actually did not involve direct fighting between Athens and Sparta directly. Instead, it had to do with Thebes. And it turns out that this decade, from 457 to 447, was one of the most transformative for the Athenians in their military history, because the setbacks that they would suffer after some of the successes that they had achieved would actually change their military position in a way that they did not even Pericles was able to foresee. And that would end up weakening them for later when they actually did have to take on the big war, when they discovered, to their, I think, somewhat surprise, that they actually were not as well prepared for the war as Pericles believed. So it's Thebes which actually matters the most in the First Peloponnesian War, which again will have ramifications in the big war. So Athens, in its conflict with Sparta, recognized that if Athens could detach Thebes and Boeotia, the confederation of cities around Thebes, away from the Spartans as allies, that the Athenians would have much greater supremacy in the Greek world in contrast to the Spartans. So there were two invasions that were done in Boeotia in 457 BC, 4 years after the outbreak of the war. And there was one battle, Tanagra, which was a failure by the Athenians. But then there was a subsequent battle, Oenophyta, that's Oenophyta, that was a success. When that happened, the Athenians were successful at taking over the territory of Boeotia and essentially getting temporary supremacy over the Thebans. However, in time, the Thebans were able to amass a counter-resistance movement, and in 447 BC, at a point when the Athenians were starting to have other problems with the Delian League, including that disaster in Egypt in 454 BC, and all the problems about the money from Delos. While all that was going on, the Thebans chose the correct opportunity to counterstrike. The Athenians tried to hold off, but they failed at the very important battle of Coronea in 447 BC. When that happened, the Athenians lost the control they had previously held over the Thebans. Now, there actually are three important conflicts the Athenians were confronted with as crises right in this time period. You have Thebes, which is the city that broke away because of the Battle of Coronea. You have Megara, which turned over from being an Athenian ally to a Spartan ally. And you finally have Euboea, that in the year after the Battle of Coronea chose to revolt from the Delian League. That was the one that we talked about in the previous video about revolts. When that happened, the Athenians all of a sudden, under Pericles, were confronted with three separate crises in different directions. And the problem was, with all three of these crises all happening at the same time, which was the one that they were going to deal with. So Pericles finally chose to deal with Euboea, and was able actually to carry out a bit of political brinkmanship to get the Euboeans forced back into the Delian League. But although that was a big success of his to counteract that revolt, the cost was that Thebes escaped completely, as did Megara. Both of them would end up being Spartan allies instead of Athenian allies, and as a consequence, Pericles would find it necessary to go after the Megarians specifically in a punitive way, and the Athenians were compelled to deal with the Thebans as entrenched enemies when the actual war broke out. And the Thebans would cause quite a bit of trouble for the Athenians, as we will see when we get to the major war. So the First Peloponnesian War itself basically went back and forth and didn't really resolve very much in terms of where the power really lay in the Greek world with these two superpowers. Essentially, its conclusion was, well, the Athenians were powerful before, they get to still be powerful. Well, the Spartans were powerful down in the Peloponnesus, they get to still be powerful. So not much was changed. However, the new terms that would come up of the relations between them would in fact lay the groundwork unwittingly for the problems that would beset both the Athenians and the Spartans in the following decade. More on that coming up in a later video. Come on back very soon. We'll talk about the final outcome of the First Peloponnesian War.